The way we use usestate is correct. We're passing in a state, we're getting back this array which we're storing in this constant. But the way we update the state is not correct. There's one super important difference when you compare usestate and how you work with state and functional components to how you worked with setState and the state and class-based components. There's an important difference between these two concepts. For usestate, as I mentioned earlier, you can manage any state. It doesn't have to be an object. You could just manage some text here. But here I decided to work with an object because I have, well, two types of state or two input fields which I want to manage. Now in class-based components, you always had to use an object, but there, whenever you call setState, whichever object you passed into setState was merged with your existing state. So there, if we passed in an object with a title property, it would be merged with our current state, and the amount property would not be lost, but simply the title property would be updated, and all old state would be kept. With usestate, that's different. This updating function, this second element of our array, does update the state, but it does so by replacing the current state with this, which in this case means if we type into the title, our new state simply is an object which only has a title property, and we drop the amount property. Our new state is an object that simply doesn't have an amount property anymore. That's why I'm getting this warning that the input of type number is uncontrolled. That's our second input, and I'm getting a warning regarding that input when we type into the first input, because the second input, this amount input here, which is of type number, this of course refers to the amount property in our state. Now if we type into the first input, we update this state to now be an object which only has a title property. Hence the property we're trying to access on the second input, the amount property, simply doesn't exist anymore, and that's exactly what's causing this error. The solution is simple. When we update the state, we have to ensure that we don't lose any old data. That's now our responsibility because React doesn't merge that automatically for us. And whilst this might sound like a bad change, whilst this might sound like it should do that for us, you'll later learn why React actually doesn't merge this for us anymore. Because now we actually have more flexibility regarding how we manage state. If we decide to manage some object state though, which very well might be the case in many situations, we have to ensure that whenever we update it, we don't lose any old data. So when we update the title here, we also have to set the amount property and simply set it to our, well, current amount state, so to the unchanged amount state, by accessing input state 0, so the current state snapshot.amount, for example. On the other hand, when we update the amount, we should also make sure that we don't lose the title by also setting this to input state 0.title. Now if you do that, if you make sure that when you update the state, you don't lose any information, now if I type here, you see I get no warnings anymore, and of course this button doesn't do anything because we haven't connected it anymore, but these inputs are now working correctly. Nonetheless, our code here, the updating code, is not 100% correct yet. Reason for that is that I'm accessing the current state snapshot on the first array element, and of course that does hold the current state snapshot for this render cycle of the component. But the way React updates the state, we are not having a 100% guarantee here that our current state snapshot actually is the latest state we committed. And this might sound strange, but due to the way React re-renders components upon state updates and so on, you could theoretically have a case where there's a lot going on your page, let's say a lot of animations or a lot of stuff, that React decides to defer a state update until there's less work going on, and therefore a user might be typing here into the title input before the latest amount input, because the user also typed in the amount input field a second ago, before that state change has been rendered to the screen. Now, it's very unlikely for this to happen, and in this simple application here, it will never happen actually. But in more complex apps, you could have a case where you're changing some state and your latest state change hasn't been committed yet, hasn't been rendered to the screen yet. Hence, if you have a new state change that also depends on your latest state snapshot, then you don't have a guarantee that this state snapshot has already been, well, committed or created, and therefore this here, accessing our latest state value like this, is not the ideal way. Instead, this updating function, so this function stored as a second element in your array, has an alternative form which you can use. Instead of just passing a value to that update function, so to that function that sets a new state, you can also pass a function to that function, an anonymous function, for example, but it could of course also be a named one. And if you pass a function here, which of course has to return your new state value in the end, and I'm wrapping it in brackets here so that I can use this inline notation here, this inline arrow function notation, that after the arrow, this is the value we're returning, and we're returning an object here without the extra brackets. This would be treated as the function body, and this would simply be an incorrect function body. Now we indicate to JavaScript that this here is our function body, and this is actually the return value, which is just an object. So now we're returning that object, but in this function, which we're passing to this setState function here, so to say, there we get an argument passed in automatically by React. And that's our previous input state, or whatever you want to call it. And we can omit these brackets here. So here, this function will actually tell React that we want to get the latest state that we set, even if it hasn't been fully committed yet for this render cycle. So now previous input state allows us to access this previous input state like this. And the difference to using input state 0 is that we're now not using the latest state which has been fully committed and which is used in this render cycle of this component, but that we're using the latest state we set with an updating function, no matter if React already recreated the function or not based on that last update. So now here we have the guarantee that we get the latest state at all times. That's of course what we want here. And here I'm missing an extra bracket, by the way, to close that input state 1 function. So now this is the approach I also want to use down there for the amount input. We get our previous input state, and then here we're returning a JavaScript object, and in that object I can use that previous input state to set the title or the amount. Now with that, if we save that and we go back, you'll actually notice a strange behavior though. If you start typing, you'll get an error. And that error tells you that you reused an event, essentially. Now, the problem here is that when we're passing a function to this function here, to this setState function in the end, then we're having this anonymous function here, and that's a closure. So that's simply a function that closes over surrounding values. And in this case, it closes over our event here. The event is fed into this onChange anonymous function, and in that function which we have here, upon a change, we're calling the setState function, so we're calling a function, but then I'm also defining yet another nested function here. So we have function 1, which is our event function, and function 2, which is our updating function. Now the problem with that is that if in this inner function here, I use something from the outer function, which I'm using the event, then this event will be locked in for the first keystroke, essentially, which means that for subsequent keystrokes, we don't use the new keystroke event, but the previous one, which of course is then reused and which causes this error. Now, normally that wouldn't be a problem, of course, because yes, this inner function, this state updating function is a closure, and therefore it closes over the event object, which means it saves this event object for its execution so that when this inner state updating function runs, which happens asynchronously, we're guaranteed to use the event that was triggered for that keystroke, so that was created for that keystroke. The problem with events, and that's not really exclusive to events in React, just is that React events are not the native DOM events, but special synthetic events created by React, which basically replicate the native DOM events you would normally get, but React adds a special factor to that. It pulls these event objects, which simply means it reuses event objects. So instead of creating a new event object for every keystroke, it instead reuses the previous object. And the consequence of this is that for the second keystroke, since we have a closure and we locked in the event for the first keystroke, for the second keystroke, we still reuse that same object we had for the first keystroke. And that simply is the problem here. We're reusing the wrong event object because of the way React handles event objects. Now, I'm aware of this sounding very confusing. In the end, this is really a special case because of the way React handles these event objects. The solution is that outside of this setState function, we create a constant, for example, which we here on the title could call new title. And there I store event target value. Now this will be recreated whenever we're typing. And now we need a real function body though. So we need to wrap this into curly braces because now we actually have more than one line. We're not just returning something. We're not just executing one expression, but we have two statements here. So now here I'm storing the new title for every keystroke. And now this here, this setState function with this nested inner function can use new title, and this will therefore now close over this new extracted title for every keystroke instead of using that same event all the time, that same event object. Of course, we do the same for the amount. There, we now need curly braces around this entire function expression here. Then we get our new amount from event target, not title, value here, and the amount now is simply new amount. Again, simply because we're using a closure here and we want to make sure that we're generating a new amount for every keystroke, and then this will automatically be considered by this inner function instead of reusing that same event object all the time. Now with that, we can save this, go back, and now start typing here, and that now all works.